First of all, thanks everybody for joining. This is part of our best practices interview series to talk about best practices in bulk logistics. And I'm excited to have Chad Oginz with me today. Chad and I have worked together for 20 years. He's now the CEO at M2X. M2X is a logistics software platform that we integrate with. We integrate with a number of others. But M2X uses us as well for their petroleum logistics on the mobile side. So just in terms of the day, we're going to spend a little bit of time doing introductions, having Chad talk about his company and his background, and then we'll cover the same as we have in the past. We'll do strategy, technology, people, and processes to kind of talk about that in terms of the overall side of logistics. Yeah, we're looking forward to having this and doing it. We've done a few in the past. In March of last year, we did multi-compartment routing, May analytics, June mobile and driver workflows, kind of getting up to here. In February, we did fuel supply management with some commodities trading platforms for fuel. And now we're talking with Chad about M2X route optimization. So having said all that, Chad, tell us a little about your background and M2X company, and obviously now you're the CEO at M2X. So give us a background so that everybody knows who we're talking to.
Great. Well, thanks, Chris. And yeah, it's been a pleasure working the last 20 years with you. So I've been 30 years in the industry, starting off more on the operations side. So 30 years operations, supply chain technology. Started the career setting up inbound logistics networks for food service companies, really using tools like MapPoint, PO studies, Excel, circumference queries, and then showing the consolidations on a map with push pins and threads. Own my own 3PL, so I was asset, non-asset based, had a dedicated environment for chicken hauling, produce, Lucent Technologies, was also a broker. So did that for many years. That's a podcast on its own. From there, I've worked for some of the best technology companies out there and worked with, a lot of amazing mid-market Fortune 1000 companies over the 30 years. I definitely seen a lot.
Yeah.
I can tell you that much.
And from an M2X standpoint, tell us about M2X. Because obviously you have a routing engine and we've got, implementations that we integrate with you guys on the routing side.
Yeah, M2X been around for 10 years, customer-centric, dynamic company. It's cloud native from the start. So starting 10 years ago, building everything from the ground up with a vertical focus. When you get to cloud native, it's all about built for purpose. So, we work on energy, dairy, agriculture, livestock, and distribution, and they all have their own nuances and specific workflows. So we really focus on automating and optimizing the order to cash cycle, really driving down costs, adding efficiencies, and giving that control tower visibility. So yeah, 10 years going through, New Zealand, Australia, the US, and it's been fun. Some great customers.
Started in dairy, which surprisingly has a lot of similarities to petroleum because you can't put organic and non-organic and stuff. But you started in dairy and then have built out what other modules, what other areas?
Yeah, so livestock. So if you think about like New Zealand and Australia, they're very self-contained countries. So between livestock and dairy and agriculture, they have very complex supply chains, making sure they cover a lot of territory and different types of territories. So it's, if you really look at it, it's all the verticals that, people get around to because they're highly complex. It's not like it's pure distribution, pallets and boxes, and everything fits perfectly.
Right.
So.
And yeah, so when you talk about bulk logistics, like tell me what you mean when you're thinking of it. So when we have a conversation today, kind of what all does that include?
Yeah, so bulk is basically anything that goes into a tanker of some sort, oil, gas, chemical, food grade, beer, wine, you name it. Feed, dry feed, liquid feed, where you have multi-compartment trucks, contamination matrices based upon product or even locations, poultry, swine farm, trailer washouts, everything that will go into a tanker, basically.
And when we integrate with you guys, we primarily integrate for the routing engine. So besides the routing engine, you have a TMS. What are the components that you include?
Yeah. So once again, if you look at the whole order to cash cycle, it's, if you're managing customers' inventory, so we have a whole forecasting and order generation piece. So we can take the telemetry and tell you when to deliver. Telemetry just tells you what's in the tank. When you have a platform that looks at, forecasting order generation, have time dependent volumes. If I deliver early, I'm delivering less. If I deliver later, I'm delivering more. So, it's everything from forecasting, order generation, route planning, if it's multi-compartment load planning, dispatching, vehicle selection, driver selection, the real resource, passing it to you for all the driver execution, what are you delivering, capturing documents, and then, having that real-time feedback, the control tower approach, so you know where your drivers are in relationship to the plan. And then, of course, all the analytics that, KPI management, dashboards, and then we do freight bill audit and pay, driver settlement. Once again, if you look at our offering, what also makes us unique is in the TMS space, we handle assets and third-party tendering. So that's where you get that reconciliation and driver pay portion to it.
I think that's a little different from kind of our experience in the past, that a lot of people have just really the route optimization and maybe not a TMS. So how do TMSs fit into that? Because I know you've talked about, like, we don't typically always see the driver settlement side, but yeah, how does the TMS fit in just from a route planning standpoint?
Well, I guess TMS is now the broader name. So you have fleet solutions, and TMS sometimes were more notorious towards third-party tendering and third-party carriers or point to point. Now, when you look at a transportation management, people are using owner operators when they have to flex. They might have a captured fleet, their own fleet. So, it really fits in holistically. Companies that have implemented ERP systems have went back to best of breed to find these components that really hone in on the nuances, and drivers pay, believe it or not, could get highly complicated.
So you've seen a lot. So what have you seen, just before we get into the details, like how have you seen the optimization market and the TMS market change in the last 10 years? What are the big things that you've seen 5 or 10 years?
Well, it's the easiest one is, cloud and AI, overly used terms, but it's the truth. I remember just over 5 years ago, a lot of my Fortune 500 companies were like, cloud, no way. We're never going to go do that. We need servers. We need to touch them. We need backup generators, the security aspect. And now everything needs to be cloud, like even optimization, just the sheer crunching using the technology where you could, run multiple iterations and different optimizations at the same time. It's just, once again, I look at how I built loads by hand. And now it's just, it's amazing.
I know for us, one of the big things on our SaaS solution is we can we don't push out mobile updates as frequently. We typically will push mobile updates out roughly once a quarter, because drivers are in the middle of delivering. But from a web software standpoint, we push updates out multiple times a month. And because it's just hard to keep up with that software. So one of the big benefits on the cloud is just, you always get the latest, but you get the latest, whether it's performance tuning or whatever. So
yeah, that's huge. When it was all on-prem, customers are like, hey, when are we going to get this? And it's all like this set schedule, and you have to wait. Now you could just, deliver every 2 weeks. And, the more you work with clients and you understand some competitive edges or additional, best practice workflows, and then you can build it in and make those changes, and it get better, monthly. So it's amazing.
jumping into the strategy side of things. So how does somebody like a CEO or a COO, how do they know they should review their logistics software? Because I know that we have some customers that are migrating from paper and some that are on Gen 1, routing solutions. So like when does somebody, from a strategy standpoint, when does somebody come back and go, hey, I should probably revisit my, transportation solution or my logistics solution?
Yeah, I think, you said it, if it's on-prem and you have to do upgrades, that's, those days have passed. So it needs to be cloud native to start. And then the strategy should depict when you need to move as well. Are you looking to centralize? So some on-prem solutions, don't have the ability, you're in your own cockpit, that's all you see. So if you wanted to centralize, you'd have to do it if your service is poor and you need to look at increasing your service. It really depends on, what the strategy is. If you're on Google Sheets, the time is now. If that's your technology, you don't want to be the next Blockbuster. So
Yeah, we've
it's
had some shocking. You and I have talked about this. I mean, we've had a handful of people that we've talked to. They're like, "No, we're paperless. We have Google Sheets. The drivers all have a shared Google Sheet on their phone." And it's like, sometimes on fuel that's okay, but it's like they miss all the optimization types of things and all the
yeah,
other.
one corrupt formula will cost them a couple $1,000,000.
Yeah.
It's
So
but
who typically drives the strategy? Do you see these being driven by the logistics team or the CFO, or like who drives it and what drives the strategy, do you think?
it depends on the size of the organization. So most cases, it's through the COO or a change agent. Somebody who starts documenting and they're starting to look at these KPIs and like, hey, things are getting out of whack. Our costs are increasing, our service is going down, like, what's going on? So it's typically going to be driven, by operations. If it's driven by IT, that's, it happens, just not that often.
Yeah.
You just got to make sure you include IT in when you're looking at new solutions, because,
And I
eventually you
know
have to sit down with them.
we have an ROI worksheet, and I know you've got a pretty advanced ROI calculator. I mean, is it typically, do you see people doing this by ROI, or do you see people looking at it, and deciding it's just something they need to do? Like an ERP system, like you don't have an ROI on an ERP system. You either need a small, medium, or large. You just need to figure out, are you growing? And so you need to get one that you can grow into, or you're staying the same. But yeah, it's not, our ERPs aren't ROI driven. I don't know how often you see the logistics side ROI, or is it just, hey, you just need to get the right size for your growth?
It's probably 70, 80% ROI. So when you're on a Gen 1 solution, like, why should this project, go over another one? The solution's working fine. I'm not looking to centralize, so a lot of times it's ROI, but 20, 25% of the time it's pure strategic. Hey, we need to get better on customer service. We need better tools. We want to provide, a customer with visibility of the deliveries and have these portals, and it's a strategic decision, to go paperless. And so it's mostly ROI, and that's really, it should be. It got to add value. I don't want to go in and replace something and not make the customer more efficient or save money, just for the sake of change. No, nobody wants to do that. So, it's really, mostly ROI, but some strategic decisions.
And what do you, what, like when you talk to um, customer leadership, what are the biggest challenges they have from a strategy standpoint? Like, because you've seen this over a long period of time.
Yeah, it's always change. It's change management in every way. So if you're centralizing, taking, the decision making from the local and putting it to a centralized, there's a lot of change management, a lot of rules of engagement you have to set up, and you have to work through some things. So, the execution of the change and the adoption of the change, and change takes place across the entire spectrum. I've had customers that handle the internal change well, but they went from static route deliveries to on-demand dynamic, and they never told their customers. So all of a sudden, customer service got 80,000 calls on a Monday saying, the truck's usually here, where is it? It's like, So, strategy is all about change management, adoption, understanding what the goals of the change are. But yeah, I'd say probably the biggest challenge.
From a process standpoint, I guess if we move on, when you like, how do people implement these kinds of solutions? Like, do you typically see them going, every module and depot by depot, or rolling out by, hey, let's start with routing and then we'll do order generation later? What's the process that, that you've seen?
Yeah, so I'd say I learned this 25 years ago. You don't want to boil the ocean. So that was a term in the ERP days. And, when you roll out, it's really identifying the best way to start the implementation so it's successful. If, you're already set up regionally and you're going from a generation one solution to two, and you set up regionally, you might have to pick a region to start instead of a depot. You always want to start with one. I would say from a location. You don't want to make multiple mistakes. If you roll out 6 places at once and they're like, oh, it's terrible. You want to talk about change management catastrophe. That's where, it's going to be hard to recoup. And then, from a modular perspective, it goes back to change again. I think if you change the routing solution and the mobile, and you have all this change management, and you have 800 drivers, do you say, hey, maybe we start with the planning and then the mobile? If they never did forecasting and order generation, we might start with the routing and dispatch, collect information, have that as a phase two. But phasing it in is the best way. You learn as you go. One of the things that I've learned early on is the devil's in the detail, and you have to have the ability to, make those changes before, things blow up.
Do you, obviously we do a lot of petroleum, or primarily petroleum and, chemicals, but what are like from a process standpoint, do you start with KPIs? Like, so when you, like do you do a baseline typically before you start and then do the implementation, and then they go back and look afterwards and say, hey, did we achieve those goals? Like, how often do you see that? And ask about the KPIs as well.
So to me, like right now, that's what we're doing. So it's the best way to start off in baseline. There's a lot of implementations that we do start off that they don't have the information. So we're not taking it from a BI tool. They don't have metrics. You'd be surprised how many very advanced companies, don't really even understand which KPIs they can drive their business in, which KPIs are competing KPIs. So it's definitely the best way to do it, and then it shows the value that you're bringing. So if we see these baselines, and then the project, the whole reason of doing the project is to reduce cost, or, increase gallons per mile, then we can track to see how well we're doing and then make those adjustments. So I think it's imperative, and it's something that we're doing.
From a bulk standpoint, are there 2 or 3 key KPIs? Like, I know one that we had one customer that you and I had a long time ago on the Amaze solution, and their whole goal was to get 1 more order per day, and they did, and that was like, so it was a super easy KPI. They just looked at orders per day and they got more, but like, that was almost 15 years ago. So I don't know, like, what do you see now as kind of common 1 or 2 key KPIs that people go, hey, if I can do that, then I'll do this?
It's interesting. There's a couple of, now that we have these analytics platforms and we can really pull data, revenue per gallon, labor per gallon, labor per hour. There's so many really good KPIs that you can look at. But to me, it should all be around cost and revenue, in the simplest form.
I think it's the simplest. And then I know you guys have done some data studies, and I think one of the benefits that you have at M2X is that I think it's a lot easier for you to do data studies now. I know you don't always like doing those, but you want to talk about that, and when people are
Yeah,
trying to figure this out, back to the ROI and KPIs.
yeah. So no, data studies are definitely important, but you also want to have it to where it reflects the real world. So, just to explain data studies, what we're doing is we're taking a snapshot in a point of history, and then we're going to recreate the routes in our system the way that you routed them, and then we're going to optimize and then see if we reduce equipment, miles, time, where the value that our solution can add. So, it really helps prove the value. But once again, it's understanding the business rules, setting everything up correctly so you have apples to apples. And that's one thing that we do pride ourselves on when we do these data studies, is to say, hey, we can't use hindsight. We're not Monday morning quarterbacks. So we want to use the same set. We want to have, the same road speeds, times, and stuff like that. But yeah, it's definitely a good exercise to get executive level buy-in, to be like, if that's possible, let's talk more.
So typically it would be,
Chris,
looking at hey, you had 100 orders, you did them with 10 trucks. I did it with 8.5 trucks, and I did it, I'd cut 15% of the transportation cost out. Is that, kind of at a high level, that what you'd end up seeing with the data study, like how many trucks, how many drivers, what the total time, total distance, but you're not
Yeah,
really going in and changing order volume or anything like to
no,
optimize that. You're just saying, hey, if we ran it through our engine, here's what you would have gotten.
yeah, absolutely. That's the benefit, especially going to a newer technology, is looking to see what those optimization capabilities can bring. And it's the more you could, you know, have the constraints that happen in the real world, the more you can rely on optimization. I think one of, the biggest misconceptions that I've seen in 30 years is people think optimization is the starting point. That's really the end result. There's, when you want to hit that magic button, you got to have clean data. You got to understand your business rules, those competing KPIs, those exceptions. So, you really have to understand that so you can hit that magic button and get the results that you can operationalize.
That's probably a good point. So what,
Chris,
from a data standpoint,
Chris,
yeah.
Chris and Chad, we got a question from the audience. Many companies just have ex-drivers or people who have been there for years, and this is probably regarding change management. Does this also change who is planning and routing and managing this process when you go to a Gen 2, Gen 3 routing solution?
Yes and no. So when you look at some of the Gen 2, the cloud native, they're a lot more intuitive to use. So in the traditional world where you sometimes had some of your best drivers that were amazing planners and dispatchers, and technology was a little harder to adopt because you had to import files and then send this and that. I think it's really broken up into two areas. If you're really good at planning and dispatching, the tools are a lot more intuitive. But a lot of companies are going towards, data analysts, having a center of excellence, shared service, where they're the ones mulling over the data and taking a look at the analytics and then reporting to operations on the findings. So I don't know if that was a good answer, but it's a yes and no.
I mean, you're seeing more, I think we are too, right? We're seeing more people in a data analyst role. I mean, that's probably a good takeoff. Thanks for asking that. Um, so from a data, because I think generally if you have a Gen 1 system, you probably have good data. Is that a fair statement? But what do people need from a data standpoint? Because I think there's an underestimation of how long these projects take. So that's kind of a two-part question. I'll ask the second part next, but because
So answering the first part, should the data be clean in Gen 1? No, don't take that for granted. I think one of the issues with solutions today is just having those communication feedbacks internally. Let's just say you get a whole set of new equipment, multi-compartment, different configurations, or you have a new dry van that can be fitted with totes. It has to be set up in the system correctly. Somebody has to have, ownership of the data. So a lot of times, systems start to get squirrely when the data goes bad, and that's what forces people like, oh, I can use that truck. I know it's going to fit. Like, why, somebody, please, let's not do that. So I wouldn't take it. I wouldn't make the assumption Gen 1 data is good. Data is an ongoing job, and somebody needs to own it.
So how long do these take? And, I think because it goes into the data too. So why, how long is a typical implementation? And let's say you have 100 trucks, and you're a fuel distributor. How long would a typical implementation be, and kind of what goes into the timeline for it?
Yeah. So, once again, let's talk about phased and bringing the first location live, or if you already route, regionally. So let's do best case scenario, clean data, worked on data, knew the project was coming, worked on your business rules, exceptions, really documented, your current workflows, work with your provider on 2B, you could be 4 to 6 months. There's, when you look at training, integration, testing, user acceptance testing, which is very important to make sure. And then when, there's challenges on business rules, bad data, then you could be, 12 months to get the first location.
And what kind of, because I think people don't always understand, like, because I think you may want to talk about this. There's some situations where people focus a lot on the data and hyper constrain things, and then they struggle with what happens. And then others don't really have, because, you obviously have to geocode a customer to deliver to them. So you need clean addresses. So when we talk about data, an address would be an example, but like another example would be service windows. I mean, how do people just typically open that up and say, well, I can deliver between 5 a.m. and 5 p.m. or do they go in, like, what's involved in the data part of the process that people probably don't understand?
So, I think that's a good thing to bring up, when you talk about time windows, being coming from sales myself, you look at, sales drives a lot of stuff. A lot of your constraints could be induced by the salesperson, could have been induced by the previous operations. This delivery needs to be first. I promised them first, or this time window, this is all that we're allowed to deliver. And that information could be years old. If you are doing a new project, is the most opportune time, talk about best practices, to survey your customers, checking those time windows. Let's not bring in a new solution and over constrain the model off of, bad or old information. You're going to talk to your customer on a monthly basis, at least if you deliver once a month, once a week, get out there, survey them and find out this information. And, when you look at the data, you got to have, location information, and you got to have the right order information. And if it needs to be line item information that comes across, there's constraints. So this vehicle, I can't get a 53 footer in there. I can only get a pup. So you got to understand, delivery constraints. And then, once you get onto the energy side, then can they fill at this rack? There's, certification, security clearances, you got to have it all. But the good thing is, these implementations are repetitive. So when you do start a project, it's like, these are the requirements. I really call those the prerequisites. So if, you sign with M2X, before we even kick off, we'll have a pre-kickoff and we'll say, hey, this is what we're looking to do. If you haven't started, let's get rolling. So
We got a couple more questions in there. One says 4 to 6 months to go live or to start testing.
So once again, it depends on the size of the company and the location and, the product. So, I have a client that we're going live in a little less than 4 months. So they're going live June 23rd. but they're well prepared. It really depends. So we do have some that go live
I
that
mean,
fast.
obviously part of this, I mean, you and I can talk about it, right? But it's like, there's never, you don't ever have and we'll talk about the technology next, but there's always the back office ERP integrations, right? So it's like, part of it is just doing that, even though, I think you guys and we both have a lot of pre-built integrations into, various back office systems, NetSuite, SAP, things like that. So the next question, does having a super user identified for training and being a liaison helps speed the process and testing and data cleanup? I don't.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no question about it. The super user, or depending on the size of the company, super users. It's definitely important, because not only are they the ones that have the firsthand knowledge of working closest with the provider, but they're also the ones that can help champion the change. So if you get the right super user that has the right personality and skills, it could really create a lot of positive momentum.
What talking about? We'll get into the technology, but from a skill standpoint, what skills, like who are the people involved in what skills? What are the technology skills that a company should plan to have in order to implement, a logistics solution, like especially one that's web-based routing, right? So it's like they don't need to have somebody know how to install servers, but what do they need?
Yeah, so cloud native now, and especially if a company that's looking to keep external costs down, being able to do web APIs, because that's when you look at all the integrations, being able to do that, because the fact of the matter is, I'm either building to yours or you're building to mine. So if I'm building to yours, there'll be a cost. If you're building to mine, it's your internal cost.
Yeah.
So I think that's very important. And then it's understanding the business and the operations. So having somebody that really understands the operations from a bits and bytes standpoint. And then really it starts at the top. So who do you need? You need an executive sponsor, somebody that's really going to help drive the change. And when you're doing implementations, they'll be part of what we call a steering committee meeting. They might meet every 2 weeks or a month. You give an update of the status of the project, and if there are scope creep or items, they're the ones that can help decide. So you need an executive sponsor. You need somebody that understands the web APIs, the operations. You'll need a project manager to make sure that they're organizing all the resources on the customer side. I have a project manager that always says project management is not a side gig, and it's not. So it's somebody that really needs to be focused on pushing the project and not being able to report if either side is falling behind.
Chad, we had another question for you. What have you learned in other bulk industries that can or should be applied to energy?
Great question. There's so many similarities. I think maybe what I'm learning, more from the dairy side, because I've been learning more of the dairy. I think really it's the collaboration. So, where on the energy side, you are doing vendor managed inventory, and, you really, your customer is putting a lot of faith that you're going to keep them full. On, the dairy side, there seems to be a lot more collaboration, and sharing of information, and more visibility, especially, when you're picking up from farms, and then you have to match the supply to the demand. And if there's a different protein level, it might go somewhere else. So I think there's a lot more, visibility and sharing of and collaborating on information to make the whole process better.
Because for that, like, I'm going to ask you some AI questions as part of the technology, but you guys did an email order automation too, right? So I mean, you had some pretty good success stories with that type of collaboration where, working with customers, you can talk about it, but working with customers in the format that works best with them.
Yeah, so our dairy customers have orders come in through spreadsheets and emails and 15 different ways, and all 15 customers have their own way. So through AI and document reading, we scan the emails, the spreadsheets, and we create orders out of them and import them right away. So we have customers that are like, I have two people whose only job is to read the emails and type them in, which also creates errors. So when you think about, the pain of an error, it typically starts at order entry. So yeah, lots of success with that.
But on that, I mean, I ask on AI all the time, but how do you see AI playing in on the technology side?
It's, like I said, it seems to be overused, but it's really where we're at. I look at a lot of these largest supply chain companies, they are rewriting and ripping everything up, building it from the ground up, leveraging AI. It's complete rewrites. It's changing everything. We're looking at how it can enhance things, for ourselves right now. Just simple, when you look at the ability to read and summarize, like I would love for like order to cash. I mean, what do you call it? Cost to serve. Somebody summarizing and saying, Chad, you deliver every day. You should change the tank size, and you can deliver once a week and save this amount of money. Chad, this customer, is delivering, receiving less volume. You should have a minimum order charge. Like, it's going to get there where I just have like, I read my morning newspaper, it's going to summarize. So, it's all coming. Well, it's all here. It's just implementing it.
One of the big areas you'll see on AI, I think that we've seen is like your ordered, email ordering is document processing. There's this term called RPA, robotic process automation. IBM's kind of big in this whole thing, particularly in the insurance agent industry, but we've got some prototypes, but we're moving to use AI to read BOLs and have the document that the driver gets at the terminal read. And we've got a pretty good demo of it where it reads it. We can consistently read the BOL number and then supplier and all the document information. The challenge is every terminal is different. So one calls it ULSD2, one is ULSD#2. So AI is good at, inferring and transferring that. But I mean, our goal is to get instead, because we have a scanning option that just like you scan with checks, it'll do edge detection and things like that. But it doesn't really effectively read it and process the document. So for us, I mean, that's an example I think that will end up, hopefully having a big impact so that the drivers aren't keying stuff in from BOLs because they're different at every terminal. The suppliers are different. The products are not named consistently, the whole thing. So
that's the exciting opportunity.
Chris, we've got another question. Can drivers also give us, being the company dispatchers, live updates about their deliveries through the app, arrival and departure time?
Yeah, that's our mobile solution that's integrated with M2X. Yes, that's so you get live updates from the drivers. The drivers don't announce when they're going to arrive or depart. It's calculated based on their sequence of stops and where they are in their route. But the drivers definitely, we have a notification system, BizSpeed does, that'll notify customers for advanced ship. So the day before we plan in M2X, send it to us and we'll send a notification on when it's going to be delivered. When the driver's out for delivery, they can get a text or an email. They can also the customers can get an on the way either when they're the next stop or when they're a certain number of minutes out. So that would kind of automate that. And we have a dashboard that helps, for those of you not familiar with our stuff, there's a dashboard that'll track the plans from M2X as an example. So to keep on schedule here, a couple of things. We talked a little bit about people. So I won't ask who's involved in the project, but what do you see as the biggest people challenges when you do these implementations?
It's a softball. Once again, it's change, and it's also having the right people. in the right lanes. So I think, when you look at the people challenge, it's really finding the right personalities and the right people to help lead the change. And you need everybody, because one thing also learned, when people are like, oh, this is logistics or it's just transportation, and they think it's, oh, this is only this department. It affects sales, it affects customer service, everybody. So it's always change, it's adoption, and it's really finding the right people, putting them in the right roles.
And what about, how do you overcome, dispatcher and sales rep resistance? Dispatchers, hey, I know it all up here. There's no way the computer can do what I do, kind of a thing.
Yeah. So it's not to get to that point. So it's bringing them earlier in the process. So Chris, I don't know if you remember 20 years ago when we first brought mobile, and the drivers were sitting, in the room, and they were scared to hold these big bricks, and we put bubble breaker, and they're like, go home, play, have your kids play with it, getting them into, the process early. And even the dispatchers, even our early generation 1 solutions that I was working with, you can configure the layout of the screen. So just getting them to say, hey, I like this column, or this should be here, or where's this information, getting them in helps. But if you can't, and there's still resistance, which there always is, incentives is a wonderful thing. There's when you look at the savings a system can bring, whether it's having a driver incentive program, or dispatches on how they plan, that they can have an incentive. But if you're not set up to do incentives, it's really working with them and finding out how they can help. Really saying, I need you to help me, and putting it on them. Say, how can you help me? And they'll put on a different hat when you ask those questions.
Got it. There's a comment out here. Somebody said, ask them what they're trying to achieve, have them show how they do it, and then show what the system did, and ask them how they compare. So yeah. I mean, it's just a lot of times dispatchers, because obviously there's a lot of sensitivity around centralizing dispatch, where you go, hey, I've got 8 branches and I really only need 1 or 2. And, and that part of the process change can be challenging. So
yeah.
We're close to the end, so I'll see if there's any other questions, but I've got a lightning round questions for you at the end. So if anybody has any questions, raise your hand or ask them now. And
this wasn't the lightning round?
It's the lightning round.
I thought that's what we were doing.
What's the craziest aha moment that a customer shared after seeing their delivery routes optimized for the first time?
Yeah, one of my favorites is, after the first week, they were able to remove 3 out of 12 trucks. So data study, and one of the things I was competing against was purchasing new equipment. And I kept saying, you don't need all the equipment you have, and I know everybody likes shiny new trucks, but after the first week, they're like, literally, I could sunset 3 trucks. And that was a great aha moment. And then, just in January, I took a prospect to a customer, and talking about just the order import robot. They said, hey, they had an on-prem solution, which also meant you needed to be on-prem to use it. It was the first time they were able to do, the holidays and New Year's remote. So they're able to plan for the whole week and handle everything. So they were like, this is just amazing. So I think those 2 stick out.
What's one feature in your platform that most surprises customers with how much time and money it saves?
So the optimization feature for sure. And then, just all the automation on the order imports and the ability to scan and read documents, it's definitely a game changer. There's a lot of manual keying. It takes a very long time to key in a lot of this stuff.
If you could snap your fingers and add one AI capability a day, what would it be?
I wish I knew that it's going to be that, when I look at the cost to serve, like, I would love a summary. So, we are testing AI, and it's pulling all this information, and it's able to do coaching, but to be able to read the data, so everything that's out of tolerance, reading it and saying, hey, yep, change the tank, add a delivery charge, or just saying, oh, every time you did this route, you came home an hour early, or why are you scheduling 500 gallons when you've never delivered more than 200? Just having some immediate feedback. And it's here. It's just when it's going to be rolled out and leveraged correctly.
What's one piece of advice you'd want a customer to know before implementing or buying a logistics solution?
What they should know. It's all about the company. Now with cloud native, they got to be vertical specific. They got to be willing to invest time, put boots on the ground, learn your operation, really understand the nuances, and be open to, helping build that into the platform. Because the more companies that you work with, you're learning from them, and you get these best practices workflow that benefit everybody. So I'd say, find somebody who's willing to invest time with you, also wants to collaborate with you, and that's their vertical of expertise, where they're putting their time, effort, and R&D.
The last question: if you had to explain cost to serve analytics to someone outside logistics, and you had to do it just in one single tweet, what would you say cost to serve is?
So I never tweeted, but is that with pounds and hash marks?
Kind of like that. Yeah.
Did I make money? Because a lot of times, what your whole route cost you, but what did that individual stop cost you based upon, how far you had to drive, how much product, what constraints. It's a lot of robbing Peter to pay Paul. But now that you could know what your cost to deliver on a stop basis is, question, did I make money? That would be my tweet.
Awesome. Well, this has been good. We're kind of right at the top of the time. So if anybody has any questions, raise your hand or type it in the question box. Chad, this is awesome. I always like talking to you. You got a ton of experience, and I'm excited with you, as the CEO at M2X as well. So you guys are growing. You got some great, we didn't talk about the roadmap that much, but I know you've got some great vertical specific things that you're putting in there. So
yeah, it's definitely exciting times, and respect is mutual. Love working with you over the last 20 years, and let's have 20 more fun ones.
Yeah.
So I definitely appreciate everybody's time.
Well, thanks, Chad. Good talking to you as always. And if anybody has any questions, you can follow up with either me or Chad, or Charlie is on here as well, and he'll have your contact information and do a follow up for you. So thanks.
Thanks, everybody.